Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for coming today. I have a very fun-filled talk planned for you today. A lot of really interesting topics, including worms, fiber, fascinating, beans, old people, and death. So what we're going to be covering today is longevity, and these are all hot topics on the, in the field of longevity and anti-aging. So basically the idea is, how do we put off death as long as possible? And to explore these topics, we're going to be looking at some scientific research as well as some anecdotal evidence. So we're going to be talking about three different things. For one, how lifestyle choices, specifically diet, affect longevity, how genes affect longevity, and how hating people might just kill you. So I don't think it would surprise anyone to know that the things you eat affect how healthy you are and how long you live. But there's quite a bit of debate about what is healthy eating, right? So we have the paleo crowd who would have us eating bacon and butter all day long. There's the raw vegans that would be having us eat kale, the fat-free crowd, the gluten-free crowd, the juicing crowd. That's a different kind of juicing, but those people that eat boiled chicken and broccoli all day long. There's just more definitions of healthy diet than I can cover in this talk. So we're not going to try and do that, but I think it's safe to say that most of these guys would assume that the way that they're eating is the healthiest option and is going to, do the most for their life. But that's not the case. So who's right? Before we get into that, we should probably just clarify that there is a difference between eating for performance, aesthetics, and longevity, right? So the things that might be best to, reduce fat is not necessarily the thing that's going to give you the longest life. So to figure out what's going to give you the longest life, we're going to look at some areas in the world where there's a lot of really old people. And so the blue zones are these 5 areas where there is a very high concentration of centenarians, so people who have lived to be over 100. And so the 5 areas are Okinawa, Japan, Icaria, Greece, Sardinia, Italy, Nicoya, Costa Rica, and Loma Linda, California. So these places were discovered by this guy here, Dan Buettner, and here he is hanging out with some old people. And that's what he does. So he goes and he visits these places and he observes and he collects information and he looks at them all next to each other and figures out what are the commonalities, what are the things that all of these communities are doing. And not surprisingly, their diets have some similarities, and the one similarity, or the first one, is beans and greens. So all of these populations eat quite a lot of plant foods. That would be their primary source of calories, and a little bit of beans. And the other thing they have in common is a little bit of animal protein, and sometimes no animal protein at all, actually. So the point here is that a low-carb diet may not necessarily be the best for longevity. Although, eating like cold cuts and cheese all day might give you like a low body fat percentage, it is certainly not the best thing to eat if you're trying to live a long life. And there are some research studies that support this. One of the things that the diets in the blue zones have is a high fiber content. And there have been a lot of studies that show that high fiber consumption correlates, it has an inverse relationship to death of any kind. So these people basically collected a bunch of studies. They looked at the rate of death compared to people's diets, and there was a very strong correlation there. And the same goes for reduced protein intake. So I think this would probably surprise people to know, or would surprise more people to know that a lower protein intake is actually much better for extending your life. And they're doing studies now as well that you don't necessarily even need to reduce protein intake, you can just reduce certain amino acids. And they've shown the correlation there. And mostly that's been in studies with like rats and mice and stuff like that. But yeah, something to think about. So basically, the idea is to eat more plants, eat less meat and a few beans, and you will likely add a little bit of length to your life. Okay, so obviously genes probably have a little something to do with how long you live as well. So the basic idea is this. Different animals have different average lifespans, right? So what makes a fruit fly different from a cat, different from a bat, different from a person? That's their genetic code, right? So if their genetic code changes their lifespan, then somewhere in their genetic code must be something that causes them to die at different rates. That was the hypothesis that Cynthia Keaton had, and so she did some experiments with roundworms. And basically what she did is trial and error. So they went into these worms and they kind of tinkered around with their genes, and they ended up finding a gene that when they manipulated it, when they damaged it, they caused the worms to live twice as long as they normally would. And so Cynthia has a TED Talk where she covers this, and she gives this example as a way of understanding exactly how significant that change is. So imagine you're like a 30-year-old guy and you meet a girl that you think is attractive and interesting, and you ask her out on a date, and you guys go out, and you are talking at dinner, and you ask her how old she is, and she says she's 60 years old. And like otherwise you would have no idea, right? So that's how it worked with these worms. They were twice as old as the normal worms, and they were behaving like the worms half their age. So I don't know if worms go on dates, but you get the connection. So the gene that they tampered with was called DAF2, and it is a hormone receptor. And there are similar receptors in humans, the receptor for IGF-1 and for insulin. And so you could, you might think, if they were able to do this in worms, why not in humans? And although they haven't done any studies where they've actually gone in and tampered with human genes, there have been some studies where they looked at populations of old people. So in this particular study, they looked at the IGF-1 receptors for people between 60 and 75, 75 to 80, and 80 to 100. And the older the people were, the more likely it was that they would have a particular mutation in that gene. So it does look like there is absolutely a genetic component to aging. But the good news is that recently there has been the emergence of this new science called epigenetics, and the idea is that you're born with your gene code, but that environmental influences can sort of turn off and on genes or change the way that they express themselves. So there is hope for you if you don't have that particular mutation. Okay, so this is a chart here that describes Julian Holt. She is a researcher at BYU, and she did a study where she took thousands of people, middle-aged people, and she basically asked them a lot of questions about their lifestyles and the environment that they lived in, and got the data, waited 7 years, and then looked at who survived the 7 years, and then figured out what was common among those people. So it's interesting to see that the things that we've discussed already today are not even on the chart. And basically, so at the bottom there are the things that least influence longevity, and then at the top are the things that influence it most. So quitting smoking, that will extend your life, obviously. But the top 2 things, does anybody have any idea what those might be? You had to guess.
Close relationships with people.
Oh, yes!
Solid. Ding, ding, ding.
Right on the money. Close relationships. The most important factors as far as this particular researcher, as far as what she was able to find were like social components. So basically close relationships, if you have people that you can rely on, and you know, when you have like bad times or for celebrations, people that you have like a close emotional connection to. People who had those really strong connections were much longer lived, surprisingly. But if you don't have close friends and family, the most important factor does not necessarily require a lot of intimacy, just a willingness to interact with people. So basically, if you're the type of person that chats it up with the lady at the grocery store, if you say hi to your neighbors, if you talk to your mailman, then you are a person who's socially integrated, which is, according to this researcher, one of the most important things in determining how long someone will live. Yeah. So if you hate people, you're probably going to die younger.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so in conclusion, there are 3 things that you can do to extend your life. Eating more plant-based foods, legumes, and less animal protein. Having close relationships with people and being socially integrated. And if you're lucky, having the right gene mutations. Thank you so much for coming today. I really appreciate you taking 20, 30 minutes out of your Friday night, and I hope that the things you learned will extend your life exponentially. Does anyone have any questions?
How come you use your instead of why are you?
Oh, golly. I don't have a good answer for that. Anything related to the content of the...
Wait. No.
I'm curious more about like performance based, but that makes sense as far as the diet thing, plant based, but
Yeah. I mean, for me, the information that I learned is the opposite of how I eat, like in terms of longevity. Like I'm totally the person that will eat.
low carb.
Yeah.
Me too.
Yeah, or just no carb, depending on the week, because I'll binge on pizza and burritos too. But yeah, there's actually a lot of studies that show that IGF, so the IGF-1 receptor, right? So there's insulin that breaks down sugars, right? And then IGF-1 is what gets turned on when you eat like a ketogenic diet.
Yeah.
So the receptors that were damaged in those, well, that are in humans that are similar to those worms, are the ones that take that IGF-1 hormone and transmit it into the cell. So basically, the hormone that's produced by eating a ketogenic diet is actually like the opposite of what these studies suggest is good for longevity.
Oh wow, that's
Yeah.
interesting, but not
Right?
surprising if you think about it.
Yeah, I guess so. But then I've also heard the same goes for intermittent fasting too. Like that's supposed to increase IGF-1. So
I like intermittent fasting.
I know, me too. So, what do you do? I mean, I think it's still like a science that is like new, so we'll probably learn more. I think it changes all the time.
It's like every few years you find out something 5 years ago was terrible, and then the ongoing thing, it's like everybody's body's different to some degree. So I'm like, hey, this is hype, but how do I feel?
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Know your body.
Did you say earlier that the gender roles place it?
Yes.
How does that work out?
So women live longer than men.
Yeah, I know that.
Yeah, it's not too significant. It's like around 5 years. But there's some speculation that the reason for that is that social component, that women have better close friendships, and
I can see
men
that.
they
close down to themselves more?
I guess so, or maybe